The Democratic Republic of Congo has just made an announcement that will reshape the global economy for decades to come. Standing before international observers in New York, government officials confirmed what European boardrooms have been dreading for months. The cobalt export restrictions are not temporary, they are not negotiable. They are the new reality. And no amount of pressure from foreign powers, not from China, not from Europe, not from anyone, will change the course the DRC has set. For those who have not been paying attention, this is the moment the world's power structure begins to crack. Cobalt is not just another mineral. It is the lifeblood of every electric vehicle rolling off assembly lines in Stuttgart and Detroit. It is the backbone of every battery system, powering the green revolution that politicians promised would save the planet. It is the silent metal that makes modern technology possible, from smartphones to satellites, from medical equipment to military defense systems. And 70% of it comes from one place: the Democratic Republic of Congo. For over a century, that cobalt flowed outward like a river with no dam. It left Congolese soil by the trainload, shipped to smelters in Belgium, refined in facilities across Europe, processed into batteries that powered vehicles the miners themselves could never afford. The pattern was predictable, efficient, and brutally unfair. Africa provided the raw material. Europe captured the value. The profits stayed in Frankfurt and Paris. The pollution stayed in Katanga and Lualaba. The children who dug through toxic earth with bare hands never saw a single euro of the trillions their labor generated. That system died this year. The DRC imposed a complete ban on raw cobalt exports in February. The global markets trembled. Analysts assured investors it was a negotiating tactic, a bluff designed to extract better terms. Surely the Congolese government would come to its senses. Surely they understood they needed foreign investment. Surely they would not risk alienating the very companies that had built the extraction infrastructure over decades. But the ban held, and now it transforms into something even more strategic. Starting next month, the export ban becomes a quota system. For the remainder of this year, only 18,125 tons of cobalt will be allowed to leave Congolese borders. In 2026, that number rises to 96,600 tons. In 2027, the same. These are not the numbers of a country desperate to sell. These are the numbers of a country that has finally realized it holds the entire deck of cards. The quotas are not about maximizing export revenue. They are about forcing the world to build refineries, processing plants, and battery manufacturing facilities on African soil. They are about transforming the DRC from a mine into an industrial power. The implications are staggering. Every electric vehicle manufacturer in the world has built their supply chain around one assumption: that Congolese cobalt would always be available, always be cheap, always flow freely to wherever it was needed. Tesla planned its gigafactories around that assumption. Volkswagen engineered its entire electric lineup around it. BMW, Mercedes, Renault, Stellantis, every major automaker in Europe and America designed their futures, believing that Africa would remain the silent supplier, grateful for whatever scraps of investment trickled back. That assumption is now worthless. The spreadsheets are obsolete. The 5-year plans are fantasy, because without cobalt, lithium-ion batteries lose their stability. Without cobalt, energy density collapses. Without cobalt, charging cycles become unreliable and vehicle range shrinks to levels consumers will not accept. There is no electric vehicle revolution without this one metal, and the country that controls it has just announced that business as usual is over forever. Inside the halls of the European Commission, panic is barely concealed. Officials speak carefully in public, using diplomatic language about partnership and mutual benefit. But behind closed doors, the conversations are frantic. Battery manufacturers are demanding action. Automakers are warning of production delays. Investors are questioning whether the entire green transition strategy is viable. Because Europe cannot manufacture cobalt, Germany cannot mine it from the Black Forest. France cannot extract it from the Alps. Italy cannot dig it out of Tuscany. The geology is unforgiving. The world's cobalt deposits are concentrated in Central Africa, and the single largest reserve sits beneath Congolese soil, valued at nearly $25 trillion in future industrial output. For decades, that wealth enriched everyone except the people who lived above it. Mining contracts were signed in European capitals, negotiated by lawyers who never set foot in Lubumbashi, structured through offshore companies that paid minimal taxes, supervised by foreign engineers who treated Congolese workers as expendable labor. The profits flowed to shareholders in London and Brussels. The environmental devastation stayed in Kolwezi. The health consequences, the poisoned water, the toxic dust, the destroyed farmland, all of it remained in communities that had no political power to refuse. The Congolese government has been watching this pattern for generations, and they have been watching something else. They have been watching China. Not the China of Western media narratives, but the China that actually shows up. The China that built ports in Tanzania and railways in Kenya. The China that constructed power grids in Ethiopia and refineries in Zambia. The China that offered something Europe never did: infrastructure that creates jobs, technology transfer that builds capacity, partnerships that leave behind industrial capability instead of empty holes in the ground. Beijing understood something that Brussels refused to accept. Mineral wealth is only leverage if you control the refining process. China spent 2 decades building that control. It now dominates 70% of cobalt refining globally. It owns the chemical plants that transform raw ore into battery-grade material. It controls the supply chains that connect mines to manufacturers. And it did this not through charity, but through strategic investment in infrastructure that African nations actually wanted. The DRC learned from that example. If China could build an industrial empire by controlling processing and manufacturing, then Africa could do the same with its own resources. The new mining regulations are not about shutting out foreign investment. They are about forcing that investment to create value inside Congo instead of extracting it. Any company that wants Congolese cobalt must now build processing facilities on Congolese soil. They must employ Congolese engineers. They must establish training programs for Congolese workers. They must partner with Congolese firms. They must disclose the real value of the minerals they extract, ending decades of creative accounting that hid profits in offshore tax havens. These requirements terrify European executives because they destroy the business model that made extraction profitable. When cobalt was cheap, when labor was expendable, when environmental regulations were ignored, when taxes were avoided through legal loopholes, the profit margins were enormous. But if companies must build refineries in Lubumbashi instead of Antwerp, if they must pay fair wages instead of subsistence rates, if they must meet environmental standards and contribute to local infrastructure, then the math changes completely. The easy money disappears. The colonial discount evaporates. And here is the calculation that keeps European policymakers awake at night. They cannot build an electric vehicle industry without cobalt. They cannot get cobalt without meeting Congo's terms. But meeting those terms means admitting that decades of development policy were designed to keep Africa poor and Europe rich. It means acknowledging that the Green Revolution was built on the same extraction model as the oil industry it promised to replace. It means confronting the reality that sustainability for European consumers was purchased with misery for African miners. The political cost of that admission is enormous. So European leaders search desperately for alternatives. Can they find cobalt elsewhere? Australia has deposits, but production costs are triple what they pay in Congo, and most of that cobalt flows to Chinese refineries anyway. Canada has potential, but extraction there faces environmental litigation and indigenous land rights battles that could take decades to resolve. Indonesia has minerals, but not cobalt at the concentrations needed. Russia had reserves, but geopolitical tensions make that supply unreliable. There is no backup plan. There is no second Congo. Some analysts suggest that battery technology will simply evolve beyond cobalt. Sodium-ion batteries are being developed. Lithium iron phosphate chemistries use less cobalt. Solid-state batteries might eliminate the need entirely. But these technologies are years away from mass production, and even optimistic projections suggest cobalt will remain essential for high-performance applications through at least 2035. The transition timeline does not save Europe from its immediate problem. They need cobalt now. They need it in massive quantities, and the only country that can supply it has just announced new rules. Meanwhile, other African nations are watching closely and taking notes. Zambia, which holds vast copper reserves essential for electrical wiring and motors, has announced it will no longer export unprocessed copper ore. Zimbabwe, home to significant lithium deposits, has banned raw lithium exports and demands that processing happen domestically. Tanzania is negotiating new terms for its rare earth elements. Namibia is restructuring mining contracts to require local ownership stakes. Angola is bringing state-owned companies into the diamond trade. Across the continent, governments are moving in coordination, implementing policies that sound remarkably similar. No more raw extraction, no more value capture by foreign corporations, no more minerals leaving Africa without African workers, African engineers, and African companies benefiting from the entire supply chain. This is not a coincidence. This is a strategy. African leaders have realized that the energy transition creates a moment of leverage that may never come again. The world is desperate to move away from fossil fuels. That desperation requires massive quantities of minerals that Africa possesses. And for the first time in history, African governments are organized enough and confident enough to use that leverage collectively. They are not asking for better terms. They are demanding a complete restructuring of how mineral wealth is extracted and shared. European officials call this resource nationalism. They warn about the dangers of closed markets and restricted trade. They argue that everyone benefits from free flow of materials. But Congolese ministers have a different name for it. They call it sovereignty. They call it justice. They call it the end of 100 years of theft disguised as development. And they are not interested in lectures about free markets from the same governments that spent centuries rigging those markets in their own favor. The Cobalt pipeline that powered Europe's industrial dreams is closing. The factories that depend on cheap African minerals are facing a reckoning. The automakers that promised electric vehicles for every consumer are discovering that those promises were built on a foundation of exploitation that is no longer politically sustainable. And the investors who bet billions on a green transition are learning that the transition was never going to be cheap. It was only cheap for them because someone else was paying the real cost. That someone was Africa. And Africa has decided to stop paying. The era of extraction without compensation is over. The age of minerals without manufacturing is finished. The time when European companies could become wealthy while African communities remained poor has ended. What comes next is uncertain. But one thing is absolutely clear. The world will not get its cobalt without building the future that Congolese workers deserve. And if that means European consumers pay more for electric vehicles, if that means factories relocate to Lubumbashi instead of Leipzig, if that means profits shrink and shareholders complain, then that is the price of a transition that is actually sustainable. Not just environmentally sustainable, economically sustainable, socially sustainable, built on fairness instead of exploitation. The Democratic Republic of Congo has fired the opening shot in a resource revolution that will define the 21st century. Other nations are joining. The momentum is building. And Europe, for all its wealth and power and historical dominance, has no answer except to negotiate. The cobalt stays in the ground until the refineries come to Africa. That is the new reality. And no amount of pressure will change it.